One common point of discussion within Star Wars is that the technology feels stagnant sometimes. In some cases, like with interdictors, a type of technology used to pull ships from hyperspace or prevent them from jumping to hyperspace, we actually do get a lot of nuance explained in how a seemingly similar piece of technology actually did evolve over time. And we see the same kind of thing with laser and shield power, where the arms race of tech keeps a kind of equilibrium. But one of the biggest examples of where tech can sometimes really seem to stagnate is with the long, very long service of specific ships and classes. So today we're going to look at some of the longest serving ships and classes in Star Wars, but we're going to also break down how this sometimes works and how sometimes that complaint might be a little less valid than it may seem. First on our list today is going to be a pretty iconic pair, the Oryx Starfighter and the Hammerhead cruiser from Knights of the Old Republic. Well, the earliest appearance of these ships is in Knights of the Old Republic itself, set in 3956 BBY. Some of the subsequently released comics and sourcebooks actually brought its service history back in universe a few decades earlier, with the new essential chronology bringing it into the conflict between the Republic and the Krath, who are basically a sect of Sith cultists, by including it in some of the art for the Battle of Koros Major, which is in 3997 BBY, about 40 years before we see them in Knights of the Old Republic. The Oryx Starfighter was introduced around that same time, ironically intended to replace the aging Stinger class. Between the Krath Crusades and where we see them in Knights of the Old Republic, they form the core of the Republic fleet in the Mandalorian Wars as well. But after KOTOR, we have some records of the Hammerhead and Oryx classes serving thousands of years further. But most notably and furthest along in the timeline, the Oryx and Hammerhead are among the main Republic fighters and capital ships by the times of the New Sith Wars, which were from 2000 to 1000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Part of this will always be down to authors wanting to use something recognizable, especially since the Darth Bane books where these are mentioned and the Knight Errant comics where the Hammerheads appear definitely wanted to keep the Old Republic aesthetic made popular by the games. But notably, something we should keep in mind for every example in this video is that we don't necessarily need to think of these as being the same ship classes exactly as we see in KOTOR. In fact, with the appearances in Knight Errant, there are some very clear differences in design. Sometimes when this happens in comics, it's simply down to art style or poor drawings, but things like the location of what seems to be a hangar on the Hammerhead in the comics don't align with the size of the Hammerheads we see in Knights of the Old Republic. I'm actually not sure where the KOTOR version of the Hammerhead can have a hangar, since we don't actually see it anywhere in the game, and if you try to map out the size for what it carries, there's not really anywhere the hangar can fit, leading to many complaints when we've had to try to design one for the mod I work on in Empire at War, Revenge, but that's a me problem. The point is more that while these classes may share the same name and a similar design, in most cases you can just as easily think of them as being a continuity in aesthetic, rather than meaning that all of these ships actually served for multiple millennia in their individual instances. While that might happen in some individual instances, in most cases they're probably fresh builds using a similar overall design like we see with the Mandalorian Meteor Q carrier from the Mandalorian Civil War, being inspired by their Crusader designs from the Mandalorian Wars, which are also from around the time of Knights of the Old Republic. If these classes and aesthetics become somehow important to the faction, then it makes sense that they go back to that well and use those designs when they have newer technology. So a Hammerhead of the Knights of the Old Republic period might have different actual systems or even types of hull plating than the same Hammerhead class that you'd see in the New Sith Wars. When we are talking about a single ship being in service for that long, they've probably been Ship of Theseus so often that it's not really the same vessel anymore. As other technology has evolved with either hull plating or weapons or shielding, pretty much everything is different from when it started. But at that point, upkeep is probably so bespoke and expensive for these millennia-old ships you're better off not bothering. You're more likely to see those kinds of ships sold off privately and then used as a casino or something. A lot of the actual logistics behind this aren't the kind of thing stories are going to concern themselves with, though, so it all comes down in either direction to how exactly you decide to read these sources. But if you do decide to read all of them for yourself, then you won't need to like this video and subscribe for more. So really, it's in my best interest for you to not do that. Please keep watching instead. Do you prefer to take the differing designs in the Knight Errant comics to mean that these are actually a different, newer class of Hammerhead cruisers? Or is that just art differences and they're actually supposed to be the exact same vessels that we saw thousands of years earlier? There's another pretty iconic ship that might be this old just through the possible implications of some extra sourcebook writing by Wizards of the Coast. This is the Hapan Battle Dragon. Part of the Planet Hoppers articles on Hapes called Ladies First include the following passage. Quote, more popular entertainments dating all the way back to the Mandalorian Wars invariably portrayed the women of Hapes as bloodthirsty Amazon warriors, lusty and powerful, kidnapping women to satisfy their craven desires and keeping them as cattle, and controlling the worlds of the Consortium with a mighty fleet of battle dragons. The last part was right. End quote. So you can take that to mean that the battle dragons, or classes very much like the battle dragons, went 4,000 years in the past. And this is ultimately very similar to what we see with the Hammerhead cruisers. Is it a specific set of vessels? Is it a same specific class of vessels? Or is it a grouping of different classes? But another class of ship is somewhat iconic among fans just for this longevity, and that's the Invincible class dreadnought, originally made with the cooperation of Vaphthau and Rendili star drives 3,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, but which first turn up in Han Solo at Star's End, a Galactic Civil War era book from the earliest days of Star Wars publishing. In that book, the old vessels are serving in the Corporate Sector Authority's Navy, and this is an instance where we probably are dealing with ships that are individually quite old. There's the same class, different ship angle we already covered, but especially on the outskirts of the galaxy, there were planets who didn't really have the option to buy or build new ships, and they would slowly get filtered the older vessels of other planets' defense forces. In a galaxy where individual beings can be thousands of years old, having at least a few instances of vessels that are able to be maintained for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years on backline duty is probably not all that surprising, even if it's not necessarily as believable. The Invincible also carries on a longer tradition of shipbuilding, which goes back thousands of years even further, where it's an example of carrying on a design style, even if individual ships came and went. The Invincible was built by the Republic in what was called the 17th Alsakan conflict, named for a neighbor of Coruscant in the core, Alsakan, which rebelled several times throughout galactic history, and it was a complete ripoff of the Alsakani Atgir class, made for the same war. But if you go back to the even earlier Alsakan conflicts, particularly the 5th Alsakan conflict of around 13,000 BBY, you'll see this design isn't actually all that new. If you look past the old armor plating on it, which gives the ship a bit of a visual similarity to the Republic ships from the Tales of the Jedi comics, a crossover I appreciate in itself, you can see what's pretty much just an Atgir sitting inside, 10,000 years before the Atgir itself was made. What a lot of this kind of comes down to is pretty much just cultural continuity, where the overall shape of the ship isn't as big a practical concern for what it's doing most of the time in Star Wars, and so those design principles survive throughout multiple iterations of technological advancement. Out of universe, you can easily take it as just kind of unrealistically going for whatever is most recognizable, when you have things like the Tor Republic troopers looking a lot like the clone trooper armor, and then the Sith Empire designs that just look like earlier Star Destroyers. But I think you do need to weigh a desire for realistic in-universe progression on the fan side, and a desire for this kind of long galactic history, against the need for a consistent and recognizable Star Wars aesthetic, and making each period capable of matching people's expectations for what a Star Wars story looks like. When you always kind of want people gallivanting around the galaxy in a similar way and engaging in the same kind of ship battles, then that is a bit limiting on how different you can make the technology. Weird lightsaber power packs aside. Our final example for today may go along the biggest stretch of time for an individual ship, but we start by jumping to about 10,000 years before Yavin, to a warlord in the fringes of the Republic of the day named Val Kumari. But since there's no pictures of him, I'm instead going to show you Val Kilmer, who has a name that sounds kind of similar. His empire and their war with the Republic began a series of Kumari battleship classes, which creatively used mass drivers to throw asteroids at planets as a form of planetary bombardment. These were hugely effective at the time, but they were made largely obsolete by planetary shields spreading throughout the galaxy. This took a while, so variations existed for millennia. The Essential Guide to Warfare gave us a full design of a Kumari battleship, but the first time we saw them was actually in the 1994 sourcebook Kraken's Rebel Operatives, not to be confused with the much weirder Kraken's Threat Dossier. In this, we had a top-down view of the Cal class, which is what was built off of for the Kumari battleship picture in Essential Guide to Warfare. This instance of the Cal class, the Cal Amber, had survived its ancient service well into the Empire's reign, putting it up to 10,000 years old as a specific instance of an individual ship, though by this point it had been converted into more of a station, and more specifically it did include a casino. which is actually less rare in Star Wars than you'd think. It also happened to the Star Destroyer Virulence, which was turned by smuggler Booster Tarek into his mobile smuggling base, advertising billboard, and casino named Errant Venture, as well as an old Hutt Azelus class dreadnought, which became the spaceport Port Nowhere. That's going to do it for today's look at the oldest ships in Star Wars. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you like these as a storytelling device or era connection, whether as updated classes or specific instances of ships, or do you think that's all too unrealistic and doesn't belong in our Space Wizard franchise? Thanks for watching, and as always, special thanks to the patrons whose names you're seeing on screen right now for making these videos possible.